morning, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and jump straight into our main event. We're fortunate to be able to join, as I mentioned, by Dr. Chris Lancy from the National Hurricane Center. On the back of your agenda has his full bio. I'm sure he wants me to read the entire thing, right? But I think it speaks for itself. His many years of dedication to the professionalism clearly makes him a leader in the work that we do. So, Dr. Lancy, if you'll come on up, I will get your presentation ready to go.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and thanks everyone for being here. It's quite an honor to be back to Corpus Christi. I was here, I checked my records back in 2009 when I gave a talk at the university and a talk at the weather forecast office. And so my opportunity today is to tell you a little bit about what we do at the National Hurricane Center, both kind of big picture forecasts as well as what we do specifically for marine forecasting and our relationship with the Coast Guard. And you might be thinking, there's no way that a dude with the name Lancy works as a marine forecaster with the Coast Guard in the National Weather Service. There's no way, but that really is my last name. And you might think, with such a unique last name, when my wife and I had kids, we'd have a unique opportunity to have a first name that would really match that last name. And I thought if we had a boy, we would have named him Aaron, or if we had a girl, it would be Erin. And of course, it's pronounced Air and Lancy. So we didn't do that, but instead we did name them. This is true. That's Hurricane Mitch, that's Hurricane Elena, and that's Hurricane Frederick, all retired hurricane names. Yes, meteorologists are a little strange, okay? So, but I'm happy to talk to you today about what we do at the National Hurricane Center. It's a picture of our director, Dr. Mike Brennan, and we really take the opportunity to not just make good forecasts, as good as possible, but to communicate that. And it's going to very likely to be a busy year. That picture down there, that's not the forecast for the season, with all those tracks hitting everywhere in North America. And it's coming out tomorrow, the seasonal forecast. I'm going to tell you, though, to ignore it, because it means nothing for Texas. It means nothing for Corpus Christi. It could be super busy, but they all stay out of the Gulf of Mexico. Or it could be quiet and there's only one hurricane, but if it aims toward this port, it's going to be busy for you all. So when the forecast comes out tomorrow, again, it's not meaningful. You have to be ready every year, and that's why you all are here today. And so I really appreciate this opportunity. To paraphrase our mission statement, we're providing the best forecasts of tropical storms and hurricanes and doing marine forecasts year-round so people can stay safe and protect their livelihood as well. So I did want to talk a little bit about winter time as we're coming out of it, but folks that are going over the open ocean, it's not just hurricane threats that are our problem. This graph shows over the Gulf of Mexico in particular where you can have gale conditions or occasionally storm conditions, 50 knots. And so anywhere in the Gulf when you have a strong extratropical cyclone or a front, you can get gales. In particular, right on Tampico, Mexico, you can get some very strong, very frequent gales there because of the high mountains just inland. And so that port can be real challenging to get into down off the eastern Mexico. So we're coming out of that, and of course the threat switches to tropical storms and hurricanes. We do want to make sure that you understand the terms we're talking about, because it's important we're clear about what we're saying. And so hurricane is the generic name, but only for systems with 75-mile-per-hour winds or more. So it's the most severe of the tropical cyclones. They all have thunderstorms. They all have a spiral circulation. They all have a center. They don't have cold fronts, though. So if we get a strong storm with cold fronts in the winter, we typically don't name those. They do act differently. Once we do have a tropical cyclone, if it's got winds less than 39 miles an hour or less than 33 knots, then it's a depression. Those don't cause any substantial storm surge or wind damage, but they can cause flooding, rainfall flooding. Once the winds get to 39 miles an hour, we name it. Boy, girl, French names, English names, Spanish names, and then it gets a little more attention, and the threat still ramps up a little bit. You don't get any wind damage from tropical storms, but you can get storm surge, where the ocean is shoved ashore by the strong winds. And then if it keeps getting stronger, winds of at least 75 miles per hour or 64 knots, and it's a hurricane. And that's where you get the substantial wind-caused impacts and structural damage and rainfall flooding and tornadoes, the whole kit and caboodle. So hurricanes season is going to be here June 1st, but it's not when it should be super crazy busy. Really, it's 3 months of the year, August, September, October. You get 90% of the hurricanes just in those 3 months. So it's a 6-month season, but really the activity doesn't start picking up until late July, early August. One thing to keep in mind too, October is quite busy, but because of your location in the northwest Gulf of Mexico, by the time you get to 15 October, season's pretty much over. At least the chance for a strong hurricane go almost to zero. So keep that in mind. Even if we say it's going to be busy and we don't have much in June or July, that's expected. Really doesn't get busy till early August usually. So I have a quiz for you, and this will be interesting to see your background in hurricane education and hazards. When a hurricane makes landfall, there's 4 main threats. There's the wind-caused damage directly. There's the rainfall and the flooding that can occur. There's the storm surge where the salt water is pushed ashore. And then there's tornadoes and the rain bands of the hurricane. So of those 4, what do you think is the most deadly? All right, and so we'll take a vote here. So over the last 50 years, what has caused the most number of fatalities in the United States? So who thinks it's tornadoes? Anybody think it's tornadoes? All right, one brave soul. All right. Who thinks it's inland flooding caused by heavy rainfall? Oh, a whole bunch of folks. That's at least 1/3. Who thinks it's the wind-caused damage from the strong winds, Category 4 or 5 winds? One brave soul. All right. And who thinks it's the saltwater flooding from storm surge? The majority. Well, in this case, the majority's right. Pretty well educated. In a 50-year time period, half of the fatalities in the United States were saltwater flooding. And I cannot think of a more horrific way to go. That's really nasty conditions when the ocean comes ashore. But beyond that, another quarter are rainfall floods and mudslides. And beyond that, surf fatalities, that's about 5%. And beyond that, another 5% are ships offshore. And so 85%, the vast majority of the fatalities are due to water. And so that's why we in the National Weather Service are really promoting the concern and being prepared for the water impacts. So there has been a little bit of a change in the last 10 years. So a newer study has said, well, we've had such different type of systems that the freshwater flooding has produced over half of the fatalities in the last 10 years. So the folks that raise for storm surge are right, and the ones for rainfall flooding are right too. They're both quite hazardous. So I did want to show this video from Hurricane Ian that hit the coast of southwest Florida, because it really highlights what can happen. And there's a little bit of audio on here. You might hear it. It's a time-lapse video. And Ian was a Category 4, decimated Fort Myers, Florida. And you can see there's the salt water showing up and filling. Now watch this red house right here. This video it's amazing what they captured here. This is over about a 6-hour time period that this occurred. And there's where the house is swept away. And there were 2 people in the house at the beginning of this video. And as they realized it was getting very dangerous, they fortunately got out before the house was swept away. This happened in Florida, but it could happen right here. Corpus Christi is extremely vulnerable. John Metz and I were driving around the coastline yesterday, and yeah, there's a few bluffs that are 30 feet. They're fine. but anything less than 10 or even 15 feet above sea level is very, very vulnerable to storm surge. So part of the issue is that it's becoming a more difficult problem, not because of hurricanes changing, but because the coastline changes, that there's so many more people living in harm's way along the coast. And this graph on the bottom right shows the population for Texas, that it keeps growing. And of course, it's the coastal communities like Corpus Christi that keep growing even faster. And so it's a wonderful place to live 99% of the time. And so what happens when a hurricane comes and evacuations have to be decided, and from what I understand, it's the judge for the county that makes those decisions, there's a lot of people that got to get out of the way because you don't want them drowning from the storm surge. And that's why evacuations are called, because of concern from drowning by saltwater flooding. And so this makes it more difficult. Now, I'll show you some where we're having some success in the forecast, but keep in mind that the problem becomes more difficult to solve when there's so many more people living in harm's way. So a little bit about the tools that we use as forecasters. We start with measurements. We call them observations. Some of those are ships out over the ocean. Some are buoys that are tethered to the ocean floor. There's also radars in space that give us wind, speed, and directions over the whole ocean. So we've got a great array of information that we can use. One of the key things for us as marine forecasters is the voluntary observing ship program. And this is where captains and mates send us their measurements of winds and waves and sea level pressure. And so NOAA has embarked on trying to automate this more so that a mate doesn't have to type it up and radio it out. Instead, it's automated based on the ship's instrumentation. And so if that's of interest for your company, if you have a shipping company, let me know. We can get you signed up. In addition to the measurements at the ocean, we also have satellites that are giving us data throughout the atmosphere as well as imagery. And one of the best advances in the last several years is the new generation of satellites. So these instruments in space, they're observatories watching the Earth. They cost about $1 billion. NASA launches them. Once they're running, then NOAA runs them out of a facility in Suitland, Maryland. And for us as tropical meteorologists, we're looking for the thunderstorms because that's what fuels the hurricanes. And so this is a really critical tool for us. We would literally be blind and not be able to forecast without the satellites that everybody here pays for out of their income tax. In addition, we've got the very fortunate opportunity to have the hurricane hunters fly. So there's two groups of hurricane hunters. There's the Air Force ones out of Keesler Air Force Base with 10 C-130s, and they intentionally fly into the hurricane to find what's going on. There's also NOAA aircraft in Lakeland, Florida that fly into hurricanes as well. And the way they do it is they don't fly over, they go right through the middle, like about 2 miles above the ocean to see what's going on. And they're trying to do three things. First, where's the center of the storm? And of course, when it's like this and there's an eye, it's like, duh, it's right there. Most of the time, though, it's not as clear-cut. They're also trying to find out what are the strongest winds in the eye wall right near the center of the storm, because that's typically where the strongest winds are, close to the calm eye. And then lastly, they're trying to figure out, well, how big is it? How far do the hurricane winds go? And how far do the tropical storm winds go? Because when you have impacts like rain and wind and especially storm surge, it's not just the category, but it's also how large in extent is it. You get a large Category 2, like Ike was, you get a massive storm surge, versus a tiny Category 4, like Hurricane Charlie in Florida. Ike is going to have a bigger storm surge because of the size. All right, so that's a little bit about how we observe storms. So I want to switch to our products that we issue every 6 hours. We start with the Tropical Weather Outlook, and we begin doing these on 15 May, and we have two flavors of them. The first flavor is a 2-day forecast of any existing disturbances and what the likelihood of the system becoming a tropical depression, tropical storm. The other flavor of it is a 7-day outlook. So we're giving people now a 7-day heads up. It used to be 5 days 2 years ago. And so the areas that are shaded are where the system may form. So it kind of implies movement in this as well. This is not today. This was from last September when it was crazy busy for a while. So this is, again, this is routinely provided, and it's provided at 7 a.m. and 1 p.m., 7 p.m. and 1 a.m. every single day from now through the end of November. Once we do have a tropical cyclone, then we're starting to provide the 5-day cone forecast of where it's going to go. So this is the second quiz for you, all right? What does the cone mean? All right, we know that the forecast dots represent the positions where we think it's going to be over the next 5 days. The colors on the coast indicate either tropical storm or hurricane watches or warnings, which I'll get into in a bit. But what does the cone itself mean? How do you interpret that? So there's 3 answers. One of them is right. The first answer is it's the likely area of strong winds, either tropical storm or hurricane. That's answer 1. Answer number 2, it's the likely location of the center of the storm. Or answer number 3, it's the likely area of strong winds, heavy rainfall, and or storm surge. Those are the 3. One of them is right. Testing your hurricane knowledge. Who thinks it's number 1, it's the likely area of strong winds? Nobody? You sure? All right. Who thinks it's number 2, it's the likely location of the center of the storm? It's about a third. And who thinks it's number 3, likely area of strong winds, storm surge, heavy rainfall? And you're wrong. Sorry. It's number 2, okay? So this is a concern that people aren't understanding our products sometime. And I think part of it's on us to educate folks, but maybe to rethink them in the future. So it doesn't show where anything's going to be, except where it has the colored coastlines. So it doesn't show where the winds are going to be. It doesn't show where the waves are going to be, or the storm surge, or the rainfall. We have other products for that. So the cone graphic is really more an overview. Do not make decisions based on the cone. Do not. All right? You need to use other products for those decision making. All right? This is critical. And we'll go into those products going forward. One enhancement that we think is going to be beneficial this year, starting in August, when there's a U.S. threatening hurricane, we will include on there any inland watches or warnings, because hurricane isn't just on the coast. The hurricane winds can go inland. And so we're going to paint that. In this case, for Ian, we're showing where the inland components would have been. So that may help a little bit in the interpretation, we hope. But that's a minor change to the cone that we're going to be doing this year. What other products then? Well, track forecast, where we're saying the storm's going to be, has improved a lot in the last few decades. So here's a visual representation of that. In 1990, a 3-day forecast had an average error of about 200 miles. So if we are saying it's going to hit Mississippi, could have been anywhere from Houston over to Cedar Key, Florida. That's a big circle of uncertainty for a 3-day forecast. What is it now? Are the forecasts any better? And the answer is yes, a lot better. So now a 3-day forecast only has an average error of 100 miles. So if we're saying, in this case, hitting Mississippi, then really you're only going from New Orleans to Pensacola. So we're cutting down the false alarms. Now, we're never going to have a perfect forecast. In fact, don't tell anybody, every time we forecast, it's wrong, okay? It's true, all right? Most of the time, the errors are small. Occasionally, sometimes the errors are larger. But we want people to realize that we're never going to have perfect forecasts. So in your planning, in your decision-making for your communities, decision-making for this board, you have to take into account that there's errors, there's uncertainty. How do you do that? Well, we're trying to provide that for you. Another challenge for us is forecasting the intensity. Intensity is kind of a buzzword we use. It really means the strongest wind anywhere in the hurricane. And it's really tough to forecast because it's got a lot of physics involved. It's the water temperatures, not just at the surface, but water temperatures 50 feet, 100 feet below the surface, because the ocean is churned up by the hurricane. So if there's cold water below, it'll kill itself off. Hurricane also depends on wind shear. Upper level winds will tear apart a hurricane. It also depends on whether there's moist air or dry air. A hurricane that sucks in the Saharan air layer is going to sputter. That's good news. And lastly, strong hurricanes go through a cycle called a concentric eye wall cycle, where an outer eye develops, contracts in, kills off the inner eye, and it weakens temporarily and comes back again. So all this just goes to say it's tough forecasting how strong. It's actually easier forecasting the track. But knowing the peak winds are really difficult. And Harvey's a good example of that, where Harvey was not forecast originally to be a major hurricane, but of course it ended up as a Category 4. One way that we're providing more nuanced information is not just saying what's the strongest wind, what's the category, but locally, what are your chances for different wind thresholds? So we call this wind speed probabilities. Chance of tropical storm winds, chance of 50 knots, 60 miles an hour, or chance of hurricane winds. The way we do it, you excuse me for geeking out a little bit here, we do a mathematical technique called a Monte Carlo approach, where we take 1,000 hypothetical little hurricanes in the computer, and they all have plausible tracks, all have plausible peak winds and plausible sizes, and we count up how often those members cause different wind thresholds, either tropical storm, 50 knots, or hurricanes. And so we can provide that to you. So for example, if you are the captain of the port for Boston, and you just looked at the exact forecast, well, it's not going to hit Boston. But in this case, a little more nuanced information says, well, you've got a 40% chance of sustained tropical storm force winds in the port at Boston. Well, what do you do if you're the captain? Do you close the port? Do you put restrictions? Do you do nothing? That's not our call. But we want to provide that information to you all as decision makers. So we also use this to provide timing information about when the tropical storm winds are going to arrive, because that's usually when you want everybody to have everything done. You don't want them putting up shutters when it's blowing 40, 50 miles an hour. You don't want people taking care of their small boats when it's blowing like that. So we have, again, two ways to look at it. Bottom left is called most likely time of arrival, assuming a perfect forecast. In this case, we're saying Puerto Rico from Hurricane Maria would be expected to be hit by tropical storm force winds Wednesday morning. But taking into account the uncertainty, maybe the storm's faster than forecast, maybe it's a little bigger than forecast, or both. In that case, earliest reasonable time of arrival would be on Tuesday night. So if you want to know the timing, you can look at it either perfect forecast or reasonable worst case. For me, for my family, I want to know reasonable worst case, because I want to make sure we're ready in time. So a little more on definitions. Make sure you understand this. So we use watches and warnings in the Weather Service. Watch comes out first. For a hurricane or tropical storm, it's 48 hours in advance. And we couch it, we're saying those conditions are possible. That's the watch. If the threat is worse and it's closer in time, then we say it's a hurricane warning and conditions are expected within 36 hours. And so that's important terminology to know. Hurricane watch means you got 2 days, it might happen. Hurricane warning is now you got 36 hours, you have a full day of no winds, and it's likely to happen. So just an example of what that looks like on our cone graphic or our size graphic. That shows in red where hurricane warnings are for the Bahamas, because the threat is over the next 36 hours. And the pink shows hurricane watch for southern Florida within 48 hours. So that's wind. And again, that's taking into account the uncertainties, providing probabilistic information. What are the chances? Same thing for storm surge. We don't do an exact storm surge forecast because it's always wrong. All right? We want to provide information, reasonable worst case. What do you need to plan for? What does the port need to plan for? What do your residents need to plan for? And so we have the inundation graphic. So within 2 days of landfall, We're providing this information of, at a neighborhood level, what's reasonable worst case. And it ramps up from blue, which is 1 to 3 feet of water, to red of 9 foot or more. And so this is helpful for any user, whether it's federal, state, county, city, and down to the family level, because this is our estimate of what is worst case, reasonable worst case that you have to plan for. So building upon this, we have storm surge watches and warnings. And just like the hurricane watch, a storm surge watch, again, that's the saltwater flooding that kills people, is 48 hours in advance, where life-threatening storm surge is possible within 2 days. And then if we go to a warning, then it's life-threatening storm surge is expected within 36 hours. So again, watches at 48, warnings in 36. Warnings, we always try to give you a full day to prepare, daylight to prepare in advance. All right, so communications is critical. That's why we're here today, to talk about preparing for this hurricane season with the possibility that we could have an impact here. And we want to make sure it's consistent, that it's being communicated at the federal level, the state level, the county level, city level. And that's why our partnership with the local forecast offices is critical. Because if we're saying, oh, you got a Category 4 heading toward Corpus Christi, and the local office is saying, no, it's only going to be a tropical storm, that's problems. That's problems. Because we don't know the local area here. The local forecasters at the Weather Forecast Office, Corpus Christi, they know your neighborhoods. And so that's where their expertise comes in. All right, so a little bit about our marine side. I know that was kind of quick, but I hope I hit the important parts. So our marine side, we have 17 marine forecasters year-round, and it's called the Tropical Analysis and Forecast Branch. To paraphrase the mission statement, we make wind and wave forecasts and warnings based on wind so that folks over the open ocean can stay safe and safeguard their cargo, whether their cargo is oil or food or medicine or people. So who do you think, it's a quick quiz, who do you think some of our main customers are for our forecasts? Just shout out an answer. Who do you think our customers are for these wind and wave forecasts? Coast Guard. That's a good guess. Yes. It turns out that the main customers are the Mariners and the Mets. Oh, wait a second. Maybe not those Mariners, Mets. We got a lot of baseball fans in Miami. It's actually these Mariners and Mets. It is the Coast Guard. To some degree, it's the U.S. Navy. It's cruise ships. It's the cargo ships. It's the giant oil tankers like the one across the harbor there. It's anyone with a giant personal yacht. Does anybody have a giant personal yacht? No? I keep asking because I'm hoping somebody says yes, and I'll retire, and I'll become their personal meteorologist. Hasn't happened yet. So it's all the folks over the open ocean. So those are the Mariners. The Mets are the Caribbean meteorologists. Each country in the Caribbean and Central America and Northern and South America has their own weather service. And so they're providing nuanced, detailed information for their country, whereas we're providing the big picture. So I thought about putting the Pirates on here too, since they're a baseball team, but we don't want the Pirates using our forecasts. And the Coast Guard knows there are real pirates today, not in the U.S. So part of the reason we provide the forecast is because of the massive economic beneficial impact of the ports and commerce over the open ocean. Talking with John and Danielle, that if this port's closed, it's $400 million a day of lost revenue. I mean, it's a massive, massive economic engine. That's just one port. So we provide the forecasts for the marine conditions over the open ocean, not just for the U.S. National Weather Service, but also for the International Maritime Organization. So the IMO was founded by the United Nations after the sinking of the Titanic, when it was realized that there needed to be free warnings to cover every square inch of the global oceans. So the National Weather Service, we provide forecasts in the maps here for both the Northeast Pacific and the North Atlantic. So it's the Ocean Prediction Center that does everything north of Jacksonville in the Atlantic and everything north of San Diego in the Pacific. Our area of responsibility for the National Hurricane Center Marine Program is the Gulf, the Caribbean, and the West Atlantic, as well as the East Pacific. So we have 10 million square nautical miles, except right near the coast. So within 60 miles of the coast, so that's pretty much where all recreational vessels are going, that's the local weather forecast office. And in Texas, you have the Brownsville office, you have the Corpus Christi office here, and you have the Houston Galveston office. So there's local expertise for those near shore waters. So a little bit about how our marine forecasters work with the hurricane forecasters. Every 6 hours, the hurricane forecasters across the hall from us in Miami issue the cone graphic. An hour before the public sees it, they send it to all the local offices and our marine forecasters, and we're frantically getting a consistent message in there. Because again, we talked about a consistency, how important that is. And so for this example from Hurricane Ida, they provide the cone graphic, and then we're filling in all the details. We're filling in all the winds over the Gulf of Mexico, all the significant wave heights or seas, to have a consistent forecast message throughout the whole weather service. And this is going to be different from what you can get from raw model output. If you just look at the global forecast system on windy, for example, you ain't going to be getting the best thing. You want to be using weather service products. So when we provide forecast products at the Tropical Analysis and Forecast branch at the Hurricane Center, we're providing it in text products that are mandated by the International Maritime Organization. We have graphics that are both sent out by radio fax by U.S. Coast Guard transmitters, the closest of which is in New Orleans, and then the grids themselves. But what we've found out in the last few years, now that mariners are getting high-speed internet anywhere over the global oceans, nobody reads anymore. They all want graphics. They all want video. No one wants to read something like this, and I get that. So we're trying to provide more information both in graphical content and video content. One text product that I think is still useful, and if you have mariners that are going anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico, our offshore zone product. Each of those little shapes in the Gulf of Mexico is a distinct forecast that we provide, and we provide information about rainfall, any winds, any waves, any visibility issues. As you know, you get a lot of fog issues in the port here in the winter and spring. So that's one product that we provide that may be useful for the mariners that are going over the open ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. Another of which is providing our gridded information directly. So this is an example for Hurricane Dean when it came out of the Caribbean, and the colors represent significant wave heights. Anything yellow or red is at least 15-foot seas. And on the left side is a graphical representation of that text product nobody reads. But if I'm going to be transiting from, say, Jacksonville down to San Juan, I could look at this and 30 seconds later figure out, well, I'm going to wait till this hurricane passes through before it's going to be safe enough to transit across. That's a quick overview of some of our marine products. The rest of the time I want to talk a little bit about some of the maritime disasters and our services that we provide. So you may be familiar with the U.S. flagship, the El Faro, which was going every week from Jacksonville to San Juan and back. It had a crew of 33, and the captain made the decision to go straight from Jacksonville to San Juan, even though a tropical storm named Joaquin was forming. The initial forecasts were poor because they didn't anticipate it to become a hurricane. We didn't anticipate it to head toward the Bahamas. And he decided going directly from Jacksonville to San Juan was prudent. The forecasts changed, and as you get closer in time, the forecasts almost always improve. And the forecasts were calling for it to get stronger and get closer to the Bahamas, leaving the captain no wiggle room. And what ended up happening was he took that ship right into the middle of Category 4, where they encountered 50-foot waves. They started taking water through some of the doors. They started listing. They got more water. At some point, the engine shut off because they weren't getting oil into the engine anymore. And at that point, they went broadside to the winds and the waves. They called for Mayday. 30 minutes later, they sank. It's very sad, and is a good example, unfortunately, of anchoring, where you're making a decision on the first forecast. Don't do that, okay? The forecasts are going to change. They're going to evolve. And if he had listened to his crew members, they may have avoided that. And it was sad what happened. I know there's a lot of Coast Guard members here. There's a 299-page Marine Board report that the Coast Guard wrote because they were able to obtain the voice recording that they had from the captain and the crew members, and they were able to piece together what happened. And certainly the forecasts could have been better, but it's the decision-making that often is the recipe for a disaster, bad decision-making. And that's true with some of these other maritime disasters over the last couple of decades as well. So that's the bad news. The good news is it's pretty rare. And the reason we can see it is, you know, in years past, there would be a hurricane season every year, there would be a ship sinking. But in the last few decades, it's pretty rare. And it's because they're paying attention. And it's pretty cool, us as forecasters, we can see the vessels, the ships, taking evasive action. And here's an example. On all large vessels, you're required to have a transponder so that if you're in trouble, you can contact the local Coast Guard for whatever country and they can come rescue you. So this was for Hurricane Delta. It came off the coast of the Yucatan of Mexico, forecast to hit Louisiana like every single hurricane that year did. And you can see the ships moving out of the way. And these ships are color-coded, where you've got the green cargo ships, you got the light blue tugs and special craft working the oil platforms. It's got the orange fishing vessels. It's got the purple personal yachts, and it's got the dark blue cruise ships. And you could see that almost all of them were doing the right thing and getting out of harm's way, both where the hurricane is and where it's forecast to be. So at this point, right before landfall, look at all those red oil tankers right off the coast here and off of Houston. I think I would have been a little further away. But again, they were almost all of them doing the right thing. And then after the hurricane makes landfall, in this case, things got back to normal very quickly, in part because of the response of Coast Guard and NOAA and other agencies to check the ports and harbors and aids to navigation. And also because this particular hurricane didn't hit a very populated area. So I did want to talk a little bit more in depth about the Coast Guard. And the reason why is, you may not know it if you're not in the Coast Guard, but Coast Guard has exactly 0 forecasters. The Navy has forecasters, the Air Force has forecasters, even the Marine Corps has forecasters, not the Coast Guard. So every 10 years, a Rear Admiral in the Coast Guard and the head of the National Weather Service sign a new agreement that we in the National Weather Service are going to provide forecasts and briefing support to help the Coast Guard's life-saving mission. And in return, the Coast Guard provides the radio fax transmissions. They operate some of the NOAA weather radio up in Alaska. So it's a nice reciprocal relationship. We've really taken this to heart at the Hurricane Center, and we work very closely with the districts, whether it's District 7 in Miami, 8 in New Orleans, 11 in California, or even 14 in Honolulu. Wherever the Coast Guard search and rescue region is and our waters overlap, that's where we're going to help out. And so one aspect to that impact-based decision support services is spot forecasts. So it's a specialized spot forecast. It includes sea surface temperature to the Coast Guard if there's an airplane that's ditched, if there's a missing vessel, if there's a disabled vessel, if there's an oil spill. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that there was Deepwater Horizon. Or it could be law enforcement where you all are chasing the bad guys and you need a forecast to help out. Or it could be man overboard. In fact, I don't know if you know this, it's almost always a man overboard, not a woman. 85% of the time, it's a dude overboard, not a woman. So I think we're doing something wrong, guys. But whatever the reason, the Coast Guard needs help, we provide that. And for those that aren't do search and rescue, the reason they need sea surface temperature, because that determines how long somebody's going to live if they're a person overboard. And so, it's a huge part of the life-saving mission that the Coast Guard does. During hurricane season, again, we're working with the district, the local forecast office. They're working with the sectors and the stations. So we're providing big picture live briefings. In 2020, we did 88 of these briefings. It was super crazy busy in the Gulf of Mexico. Last year, we did 26, and almost only one for District 8. So you all lucked out last year. Don't hold your breath. I don't think you're going to luck out this year. Yeah, you better be ready. So, but it's because of the Coast Guard. They have to do 4 things to prepare for a hurricane, and forgive me if I'm simplifying it. One is you've got to figure out which of your assets to keep open and which to close and get out of harm's way. You're also trying to get your cutters, your small vessels, your fixed-wing aircraft, and your helicopters out of harm's way, but not too far away in case you have to do search and rescue. And then you're also going to have to deal with the ports. You know, which ports, like Port of Corpus Christi, are you going to restrict or close? And the captain of the port has to make that decision. And so these are really, really big decisions that the Coast Guard's making for the safety of the U.S. public and the economy of the U.S. as well. So just to wrap up, we've been trying to engage more in social media. Anytime, for example, we have a warning, we tweet it out. We also provide videos twice a week. So every Sunday afternoon, every Thursday afternoon, we do a 5-day short video of conditions over the Gulf, the Atlantic, the Caribbean. If you wanted to get notification of that, just let me know. I'd be happy to add you to it. Finally, just a word about how marine conditions and communications are changing over the open ocean. It used to be that radio communications were the only way that ships could get forecasts. But that's changing real fast because SpaceX keeps launching all these Starlink mini satellites, and now you can get very cheap, very reliable internet anywhere on the ocean. And so in the short period, mariners are accessing websites like windy.com, which has very alluring graphics. But what we want them to do is use official Weather Service forecast products. And so the International Maritime Organization is moving toward requiring vessels of large size to get into their electronic charting systems, their ECDIS, information from governmental sources. And so we're going to be providing our wind and wave forecasts. We're going to provide no-go zones, basically like hurricane no-go zone, and that's going to be available on mariners' electronic charting systems. And so that's exciting that we're moving toward that capability. So I think I'll stop there on behalf of the 17 men and women at the Tropical Analysis Forecast Branch of the Hurricane Center, and hopefully that gives you a little bit overview about what's going to happen this season and products that are available. And if there's time, I'll take a question or two. Thank you. Hold questions?
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and swap this over to Corey to kind of do a short version of what he'd presented at the Hurricane Conference for those of you that were able to attend that. And then we'll go into our break. So if you've got any direct questions for Dr. Lancey or any of the team, please feel free to do that or write them down. But we're running tight on time with you. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Corey.
All right, I'm just going to make this real fast here. I'm just going to cover a couple of key points. A lot of what I had in here, Dr. Lancey already covered. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Corey Motice. I'm the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the local National Weather Service office here. And I just kind of wanted to go over a couple of quick points about what to expect this season, potentially coming up. As Dr. Lancey said, our official forecast is coming out tomorrow. But again, that's the entire Atlantic Basin, huge area. Doesn't mean anything for us necessarily locally. We average about every 4 years a named storm here, landfalling one major hurricane about every 9 years, and that's going back to 1950. But I'm going to skip through a lot of these here and just cover a couple of the quick ones. So you can see the last 10 tropical cyclones that we've had. The main point with this that I wanted to show is that being here in the western part of the Gulf of Mexico, we tend to have a lot of hurricanes that form in the Gulf. We don't have as many that are long tracked that come out from the open Atlantic. You can see one that happened on there. That was Harvey, that big long track that you see out into the Atlantic. But all the rest since 2010 have all developed within the Gulf of Mexico itself. So that tends to give us less time to prepare locally than maybe other parts of the world or the country have. I'm gonna go through here. So that's just our Cat 4 or 5s, but I wanna focus in on the Texas coast. So a third of all the Category 4 or 5 hurricanes in the Texas coast make landfall, or in the Gulf of Mexico make landfall on the Texas coast. And that's about 17% of the storms here. 36% are major hurricanes along the Texas coast that make landfall. And if we look at all the entire rest of the Gulf, it's about the same percentage for the entire rest of the Gulf combined is what we tend to see here along the Texas coast. So El Nino and La Nina, this is the main point here I wanted to get into, is we're coming out of an El Nino, we're transitioning into a La Nina. El Nino is warmer than normal temperatures across the equatorial Pacific, which tends to be less favorable for hurricane formation because storm systems can get a little farther south, more wind shear across the Atlantic basin. La Nina is cooler than normal, and we tend to see better environments, less wind shear across that favorable development area in yellow there. We're pretty confident that we are going into a La Nina. This actually is updated since then. The red bar is pretty much all but disappeared at this point. We're near neutral conditions right now, near normal sea surface temperatures, but 80% or so probability by peak hurricane season that we're in a La Nina. So looking pretty likely. Now, if we take a look at by the seasons here for La Nina and El Nino neutral, so your blue bars are your La Ninas, red is El Nino, and you can see a pretty clear trend across the board there that we tend to see more tropical storms, more hurricanes, more major hurricanes during La Nina years, especially compared to the El Nino in red. Now, if we focus in a little bit closer here, the Texas to Alabama coastline, you can see that still see similar trend in the general hurricanes, a slight difference in the major hurricanes, not too drastic there. But certainly if we factor in some of the other variables that go into the seasons, it can be much more favorable. And if we take a look at this graphic here, I think this paints the picture pretty well. The top one in the blue, that is our last 30 La Nina years that we have had, and all the hurricane tracks, and the bottom is our last 30 El Nino years. And you can see a lot more blue lines up there than red. And the other thing to note is that a lot of the storms in the Gulf that are in the blue up there have developed in the Gulf. They didn't track out. A few did, but most of the ones that track in from way out in the Atlantic head up towards that Louisiana area, less so here. Can certainly happen. We saw it with Harvey. But generally, we have quite a bit less time to prepare on the Texas coast than a lot of other places. We have yet to have a landfalling hurricane during an El Nino year along the Texas coast going back to 1950. If we look at the La Nina years, we've had 5 hurricanes and 8 tropical storms. This year, we're going through a neutral right now and getting into a La Nina year. So if we add in those neutral years, we can see how much busier it's been. And if we look at similar years to what we're expecting this year, we actually transition from a El Nino year into a La Nina year. It's only happened 12 times since 1950, and if we look at those years that it's happened, we've seen 11 named storms, 7 tropical storms, and 4 hurricanes. But of the 4 hurricanes, 3 of them were major hurricanes that made landfall. And some of the ones on there, Celia in 1970, Rita in 2005, made landfall right along Louisiana-Texas border. Some other notable names that have occurred during similar type seasons coming up. There's a lot more that goes into it than just El Nino and La Nina and the sea surface temperatures and the depth of that warm water and different oscillations that are occurring across the ocean basins. But factoring in all that and going back in time and looking at the probabilities. So the numbers that you see in parentheses, that is our statistically typical probability that we would see if you look at Texas at the bottom of a hurricane making landfall along the Texas coast or within 50 miles. About a 36% chance is a typical year for us of a hurricane making landfall. This year, factoring in other factors and everything that we're expecting, it's a 54% chance probability of a hurricane making landfall on the Texas coast. And for a major hurricane, category 3 or higher, we're looking at a 25% probability this year, whereas typically we're at about a 16% chance. Last year we had Harold, but one of the most interesting ones from last year was actually in the Pacific, and that was Major Hurricane Otis with the rapid intensification out there. So this one was a pretty impressive storm in general. I think we got one Hurricane Hunter flight through that storm because it was not expected to be much more than, I believe, a Category 1 hurricane leading up to landfall. And it was pretty last minute that we realized this was intensifying significantly, and it was undergoing some significant rapid intensification. You can see some of the numbers there. It increased 120 miles an hour in 24 hours for the maximum sustained wind. So in just one day, it increased 120 miles an hour. They did recover some data from a anemometer that measured a peak gust of 205 miles an hour, is the strongest landfalling Eastern Pacific hurricane on record with 160 mile an hour winds. The skyrise structures there just completely blown out. I mean, the structure themselves are still okay and they're going to be able to rebuild, but there's nothing left inside of them. It blew out every window and door in those places with the 200 plus mile an hour winds in Acapulco Bay. You can see how rare it is for a forecast to be that far off. I mean, Otis is way, way, way left down there. The vast majority of the time, the National Hurricane Center forecast is the best out there, better than just about any model, which I'm not going to go into detail. Dr. Lancey covered that and how the improvement has occurred over the last many years. But you can see the black solid line up there was the 2020 to 2022 track, and better than pretty much any of the models that are out there. But even with as accurate as that forecast might be, a tiny little wiggle in the track prior to landfall can mean a huge difference for communities in that particular location. So that purple line's actual track of Laura, had you have just shifted that 20 miles to the west, that area in the yellow circle would have seen anywhere from 5 to 15 feet higher storm surge for that particular location had we have had a little wiggle prior to landfall. So it's important to be prepared, not focus on that exact track of the storm as we can see these little wiggles as they come on shore. But just a few things to think about, your weather information, make sure you're getting it from reliable sources, the National Hurricane Center, your local National Weather Service office, and making sure that you have your plans in place for both yourself, your family, your pets, elderly, your neighbors, whoever it might be. Just have your plans in place well ahead of time, know what you're going to do, and what you need to make those decisions, what kind of information. So I think I will stop there and pass it on over to Danielle.
Thank you, Corey. Awesome. Thank you very much. And we do intend to make these presentations available as appropriate after this event. I know I've already gotten several text messages and friendlies, hey-oh, by the way. So with that, let's go ahead and take a break. We've got some refreshments in the back, and we will be back here at 2:45 to get started on our panel presentation. Thank you.
We got a great panel up here, and these representatives are the agencies and organizations that have really critical roles in ensuring the preparations, ensuring the readiness of our ports and waterways to literally weather the storm. In addition, though, they also have, they're critical in the recovery and reconstitution of our ports and waterways and the activities within post-storm. So we're going to obviously drill down on that, talk a little bit about it, have some questions for them. But let me go ahead and introduce them all in no particular order here. You can see that we have the slides up here. We have to my right, who is representing what we call the South Texas Waterways Advisory Committees, or the Harbor Safety Committee, Lieutenant Commander Tony Garofalo, Chief of Waterways Management in the U.S. Coast Guard. We've got from the Port of Corpus Christi Authority, Mark Gutierrez, Director of Port Security. We have Tim Lewis from basically Port Aransas Ferries, technically the Superintendent of Ferry Operations from the Texas Department of Transportation. We've got Andrew Lewis, Area Engineer, not resident anymore, from the Southern Area Office of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Galveston Districts. And then we have Captain Forrest Albrecht, Presiding Officer of the Aransas Corpus Christi Pilots. And then we have basically Commander Mike Metz, Chief of Prevention from U.S. Coast Guard, Sector Corpus Christi. Give him a round of hand for being up here and for being part of this panel. To give the panel members a little bit of context, and to give you all a little bit of context in the audience, we're going to just basically provide a scenario. just so they can get their minds right around what we're talking about. And so when we ask pointed questions, they're able to kind of put their mind into that particular scenario. It'll be helpful for part of this discussion. Now, this scenario may look familiar to you, obviously, because if you're on Director Hale's distribution list, you'll see that it was obviously for her virtual hurricane exercise that occurred this week. Okay, so to get down to it, that the National Weather Service indicates that on Saturday, Hurricane Helene, a Category 1, will develop over the Gulf of Mexico and make landfall as a Cat 3 near Baffin Bay. Refresh my memory, what's Cat 3 again? What's miles per hour? Come on. Anybody? Besides this table? It's anything that's above, 111 miles per hour, okay? Hurricane Helene has the sustained winds of 80 miles per hour and is moving northwest. Hurricane storm surge warnings are issued for the region. Forecasters anticipate the region will see tropical storm force winds starting Sunday night, September 1st, and hurricane landfall is expected during the evening of September 2nd, which happens to be Monday, okay? Main threats will be the storm surge and obviously winds of 115 miles per hour, flooding, rains, and isolated tornadoes. Additional information, so the U.S. Coast Guard has announced the immediate move to port condition X-ray. That means that gale force winds will be at the port within 48 hours. And let's refresh our memory of what gale force winds mean. We use gale force winds. Gale force winds are 39 mile an hour or above, or if you're nautical, 34 knots. So we're setting port condition X-ray and requiring all ocean-going vessels, 500 gross tons or larger, to basically either report their intention either to depart, hopefully, or remain in port, to the captain of the port. The captain of the port has advised intention to set port condition Yankee, which you can see on that graph over to the right-hand side there, which is basically restricted. The port would be restricted on Sunday, September 1st at 8 a.m. And Yankee means that we expect to have gale force winds within the port at 24 hours, within 24 hours. So that is the scenario that we've got before it for the panel members and their particular agencies and organizations. So I'm going to ask some questions here of our panel members here, and I'll probably just go from right to left, okay? And if you guys just pass the mic, you'll have to speak on the mic, and just go ahead and pass it off. So, Tony, I will start with you representing the Harbor Safety Committee or the South Texas Waterways Advisory Committee. So, first, let's just talk about what your organization's responsibilities are, okay? What is SETWAC would be responsible for in this particular scenario?
All right, in this scenario, SETWAC was, or STWAC, what do we want to call it?
You can call it the Harbor Safety Committee.
All right, Harbor Safety Committee. I'm going to call it by the right name. So STWAC at this point is participating in what we call the Port Coordination Team meetings. Generally, leading up to a storm, we were already established these. Depending on the scenarios, probably about twice a day. So within STWAC, I think we're up to 16 industry groups that are represented, and they are participating and providing the captain of the port, the Coast Guard, information on their particular industries, where they're at in preparation, and also getting some really good information from the Army Corps, from NOAA, and the Coast Guard and other state and local government agencies on where the decisions are being made for that impact them. So generally, at this point, we're getting input from these key members, and then they're distributing information back out to their membership, so within different industry group. So information coming from the PCT, as well as collecting that information and feeding it back up to the captain of the port as part of the decision process.
So just to clarify in my mind, now the SETWAC or STWAC or the Harbor Safety Committee, choose your acronym, that is not a Coast Guard committee, is it? I mean, or are you right? Or is it?
Right. So the Coast Guard does participate, but it's an industry-led industry initiative that looks at safety for the port. So the day-to-day work that SWAC does folds in really nice with keeping the port safe and secure during an incident like this.
Okay, thanks. Good. All right, let's go a little bit now to the Port of Corpus Christi. So, Mark, Director Gutierrez, what is your organization's responsibility here based upon this particular scenario that's facing you all?
So if we're in a condition Yankee, which for us would be a hurricane readiness level 1, we're pretty much at our maximum readiness level. We're going to have our IMT most likely stood up. We'll be coordinating with, obviously, all of our partners will be participating with the Coast Guard in all their calls and meetings to ensure that we're prepared. Obviously, the number one thing is going to be the preservation of life and safety and preparing everything to ensure that we're ready for, in this case here would be a Category 3. And so with the Category 3, we'd be making our final preparations. Our CEO would have our command and general staff together to ensure that we're all tracking on the same page. Our police officers, basically all of our Tier 1 members would be wrapping up and ensuring that we're ready.
Okay.
And then our Tier 2 employees would, at the direction of their directors, would be released to go home. And we'd be just making our final preparations, getting ready. We'd have liaisons in other emergency operation centers, the city of Corpus Christi and Nueces County, to ensure that we have that constant flow of information coming back and forth to ensure that we all have the same information.
So you talked about Tier 1 and Tier 2. So describe Tier 1 employees then. Is that what you're calling like mission essential, mission critical? Because
Correct.
Everybody's terminology is a little bit different.
Yeah, and so for us it'd be our mission essential. So our police officers, our dispatchers, a lot of the directors that are going to be directly involved. The ones that would be, we would have ride-out teams, and so the Tier 1 would be within those ride-out teams. We would also, probably more than likely with a Category 3, we'd probably stand up our co-op, which is in San Antonio, Bexar County, for continued operations to ensure if anything happened here, and we suffered any sort of a loss of communications to the point that we're not able to be effective anymore, our co-op would be able to take over in Bexar County. And of course, that would all be at the direction of our CEO. He's the one that would trigger, of course, with all the information coming in from everybody within IMT to ensure that he has the best information possible.
Okay. So the Harbor Master's Office, let's talk a little bit about that then. So what's the expectation of their operations then, and how do they kind of play into this whole scenario?
So, and I know Russell's over there from the Harbor Master's Office, but not to be talking out of turn, but obviously they're going to be working closely with the Coast Guard, and ensuring that if there's any craft or any ships that are looking for safe harbor, that they'd work with that and with them and with the through the Coast Guard. Here, if we're 24 hours out, knowing that more than likely, we're going to reach Zulu when the port is closed. So they're going to be coordinating all of the vessel traffic on the water.
And they plan on, that office there plans on staying put then?
Yes, they'd be Tier 1 employees, yes. They'd be essential personnel.
Okay, wow. All right, thank you. So let's go a little bit and talk a little about the ferries, Tim. So please go ahead and describe your all's responsibility as the ferry system, Port Aransas ferries, during this pre-landfall event for this type of and size of hurricane.
Okay, at this time, the EOC and at the district office here in Corpus will be open. We will be communicating with them, communicating with the captain of the port, the harbor master here in the port of Corpus Christi. Our team will go to 12-hour shifts. We'll split our 140 employees, which are all considered essential employees. We'll be preparing the landing, getting ready for the worst case scenario.
Okay. So, and I know it's hard to predict, but when do you all stop? When would you stop operations?
12 hours before landfall is what we planned, because we are an evacuation route for the city of Port Aransas, so we try to stay, as long as it's safe, we will stay operational.
Okay. And then where do the ferries, once they're stopped and operations stop, where do they go to find a place of refuge?
We'll stay here at the landing. We've built up our operation to actually secure there in Port Aransas.
In Port Aransas?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right, Andrew Smith, Army Corps of Engineers. Same question. Different agency. What's your all's responsibilities, roles and responsibilities? Obviously, pre-hurricane. I know you have a huge post-hurricane, but pre-hurricane, what is your all's responsibilities?
So most of our pre-hurricane activity will be making sure that the plans, different action plans are taking place. The most visible stuff that folks would see here would be our contractors that are working in the channels or in the federal channels. Waterways are actually executing their hurricane plans and communicating with the captain of the port and the harbor master about what they're doing, and we'd be making sure they're doing it. Taking care of our employees, making sure they're executing individual stuff, and then getting our equipment up and out of the way, or at least secured. The other thing that would go on is we would start at this point with the navigation restoration team calls. These are normally run out of our district office and involve kind of a wide array of agencies, but at times mostly just one or two representatives, and that becomes a real key component during the recovery phase. But that'll start certainly when we're going to 72 hours out from a landfall on the Texas coast. Those calls will start up, I expect. But it's basically taking care of our folks, making sure they're getting up and out of the way, making sure our equipment's going to be safe so that we can immediately move in after a landfall and start working.
So, this is obviously particular to this port because you've got a lot of dredging operations currently ongoing. So I get that. That makes things a little bit more complex, obviously, with the amount and type and kinds of equipment that they have for that. But you all also have survey vessels here in this region, in this area, correct?
Yeah. So we have multiple trailerable assets as well as some that stay in the water. Ideally, one going into Baffin, we'd be cool here. If we wanted to, we may move up to Port O'Connor with those larger assets that are floating. You may see some stuff move down from Galveston and pre-position in Port O'Connor. The reality is, if this is Friday when that call's getting made and Saturday, we normally, and like for Harvey, say, and even Hannah, we just came in and got on the city marina docks that are floating so that we're not having to tend those lines as much. You have a lot of freeboard. In fact, we had a boat in island moorings in Port A for Harvey, so she was fine, but there was some challenges in getting to her because of the amount of sunk vessels around her. But normally put our assets either out of the way or on a floating dock that's going to be able to handle that surge. The plan would read, if it's going south, move north. If it's coming here, we don't, if you don't have time, get on a floating dock, get your trailerable assets up, in Robstown, basically, so.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. So next is obviously some agency, organization is going to be extremely busy. Captain Albrecht, can you kind of describe, obviously, what it is the Iran's Corpus Christi pilots are doing besides moving a lot of vessels?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. We're going to move ships until we can't move ships. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of, it just depends on the traffic. I mean, I think the biggest thing is we'll be in constant contact with the Coast Guard and the harbor master to monitor the situation and continue to watch and see what the plan becomes, whether people stay in the port or whether it's a mandatory evacuation of all the ships. But we're also starting to probably think about where we're going to put the pilot boats. We usually bring them up into to the inner harbor here, and that way they're readily available when we can reopen, and we use them to assess the channel and aids, and they typically stay here in the port. But at 72 hours out, we're still moving ships, monitoring the sea conditions, the winds, the waves, and on the PCT calls with the Coast Guard and the harbor master. Is there set criteria for when you all stop doing boardings of vessels? There's not a set criteria. I would say when it becomes unsafe for us to board the ships, that would be a good stopping point. Okay. But sometimes the Coast Guard shuts the channel down before that actually even happens. So we move ships as long as the Coast Guard lets us and as long as we're safe to get on and off. Okay. Appreciate that. Let's talk a little bit then about the Coast Guard's role and responsibilities here for this type of scenario to keep the port and all the facilities and the channels and everything safe in this particular scenario. Commander Metz, if you could kind of describe exactly what your all's responsibilities and then what you guys' actions will be taken during this time.
Hey, thanks, Jack. So with the Coast Guard, what's fun about us and what's really cool about our organization is I feel like we're the ones that tie everybody together wherever we go into wherever we're stationed and wherever we are placed here. At this point in time, what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be really the central hub of communications, being a part of the PCT, the Port Coordination Team, as well as just contacting other local organizations, broadcasting stuff that needs to go out via broadcast that our command center is going to send out. A lot of the work for the Coast Guard is preparing for the season, which is preparing for the hurricane season, which is done outside of June 1st. The first thing we're going to wind up doing, and we've already done it, we just have to broadcast it and send it out to everybody, is our Marine Safety Informational Bulletin, which basically describes what the Coast Guard's going to be doing throughout the different stages of the hurricane as it becomes a little bit closer to making landfall. At least for the port of X-ray, for the condition of X-ray, we're still open to traffic, like Captain said over here. But as we get closer and as the hurricane gets closer to making landfall to us, we're going to start bringing things back in, and like at least asking for remaining in-port checklists, identifying the vessels that are going to be in the port, identifying them, and then getting a plan from them, contacting the vessels, and then just making calls and coordinating with the rest of our agencies, of our locals here.
In just kind of general terms, do you prefer vessels to depart the port or to remain in port?
In any case, it's always the Coast Guard always prefers that they leave, like especially if it's a vessel over 500 gross tons. If it's a large vessel, we want them to go. If there's no reason for any of them to be in the in the path of a hurricane, but we understand that there are situations where a vessel is not going to be able to leave the port, and at that point in time, what we're going to be requesting from them is their plan. What are they planning to do in order to mitigate this? To be prepared for what's coming.
And so you spoke a little bit about a plan, and I know every plan is going to be different, every vessel is going to be different, where they're going to be tied up, but what are some of the factors and criteria you look at in evaluating kind of this remain in port request, in a sense?
So we're going to be looking at like what their mooring plan is, how many people are going to be on board the vessel, where they're actually located at, have they spoken with their facility folks, which they certainly will have. Just basically stuff that's going to be, pertinent for them to ride out the storm.
Okay. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and then hunker down and fast forward to 5 p.m. on Monday, September 2nd. Okay, so we're going to obviously ride out the storm. Hurricane Helene made landfall near Baffin Bay as predicted. Great job forecasting the landfall. As a Cat 3 with sustained winds of 125 miles an hour. Okay, now it's a tropical storm, and it's north of Austin. So Captain Port announced that port condition Zulu, okay, which is, as you can see, obviously closed, no movements within the port, occurred and remains in effect. So closed all vessel traffic and cargo operations. So now let's go ahead and move even farther forward to basically post-landfall recovery, okay, operations. Now we're going to move to Wednesday, September 4th, okay, at 10 a.m. And these are kind of what the after effects of Hurricane Helene was. Okay, we began initial recovery efforts. Search and rescues continues, but they finally begin to slow down a little bit. Power outages, huge, a vast majority of homes are still without power. This weather forecast seems pretty typical, obviously, to South Texas. Just go outside today and you'll see the same thing. And obviously, we have advised that the port remain closed while damage assessment and channel surveys can be completed. Okay, so that's what's happening right now for the post-landfall initial recovery briefing. Everybody good with that as we move on with the particular scenario and the questions? So let's talk a little bit about some of these questions for our panel members. So we're going to do the first one. Basically, I'm going to just pitch it out to every single one of them. South Texas Waterway Advisory Committee, business continuity. I know you're representing, obviously, the Harbor Safety Committee, SETWAC. Talk to us a little bit about the fact that, how does your membership address business continuity, given the fact that, comms are down, utilities are down, personnel shortages, and things like that? What is it and how is it that you would, obviously, these facilities and these constituents that make up the Harbor Safety Committee, be able to kind of articulate that?
Zach, can I pass that question?
You can pass that question.
All right.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead to the Port of Corpus Christi then. Let's talk a little bit about business continuity and the continuity of operations, Director Gutierrez. How can you kind of address what's going to happen post-hurricane recovery and the things that are going to be obviously challenging you all to get back up and going?
Yeah, so obviously it's going to depend on the severity of the damage, severity of the storm as it came in. So our first assessment is going to come with what we would call a windshield assessment, where between our police officers and we'll have a damage assessment team that's going to go out and start assessing what kind of damage we have here within our own facilities, within our AOR here at the port itself. We'll start to get that information into the Emergency Operations Center so that way we can start collecting the data and trying to get a good handle and understanding of exactly the damage that we have incurred. Obviously, if we're that far down the road, obviously if there's any, safety of life is going to be number one, right? So that would be the very first thing we would address if there was any sort of concerns. But then we'd go into our windshield assessment and try to figure out exactly what the damage is, where it is, and how severe that damage is. How is it going to impact our ability to get back to normal operations as quickly as possible?
So, I know that post-storm, lots of, fence lines blown down, your typical security forces may be in limited supply. Can you discuss kind of how that the Port Authority would assist in helping ensure the compliance with these facilities for security plans?
Yeah, so obviously we would rely heavily on our police officers who are out in the field. If we do have any breaches, any holes in our security posture as it pertains to the fences or the gates or anything like that, with our police officers and our security guards, we would, as much as possible, try to ensure that, and our operations team, we try to ensure that we can get something there that would plug that hole temporarily. But as far as trying to get people back in, especially customers or port employees back into like our restricted facilities, that's going to remain the same. We're not going to ever suspend our entrance requirements. That will remain the same as if there had been no damage. But obviously, we're going to try to do everything we can to plug any gaps that we have in our security.
Do you foresee a shortage of, security personnel? And if so, how do you kind of remedy that if there is a true shortage in just the amount of contracted security guards?
Well, for our part, for our police officers, they're all going to be here. None of them are, they're not going to be released. So, they would be here during the storm. And, we're at 47 officers. So we would have a robust ability to get officers. Now, they may not be out there in patrol cars. They might be out there in just regular port vehicles just because we wouldn't have maybe the number of patrol cars needed. But we would definitely have our officers out there in the field ensuring the security of all of our port AOR.
Good, thank you. Hey, so Port Aransas Ferry, so same question, but how do you all continue, obviously, your business? How do you plan for that and prepare for that? And what are the plans based upon the scenario to ensure, obviously, business continues, the ferry system?
As a state organization, we'd have a reentry team come into the site. They'll clear the way, get us there, check it all out, have bridge inspectors come check the landings, and then we'd have some inspectors come check the vessels, make sure there's no issues with any of the vessels, and then try to get in contact with our employees and see, if we can get them back to work so they can start cleaning up, so we can get back in operation to bring emergency vehicles back across from the Aransas Pass side.
So question for you, does anybody, is there kind of a ride-out location or anything like that for any of the ferry staff? The vessels, are they manned during?
They will not be manned.
They're not manned? Okay, gotcha. Okay. So everybody that works for the ferry system or DOT is then at their own homes and waiting for the storm to pass? Okay, that's good to know. Okay. Thank you. And you already addressed about any damage to the ferry landing, so that's good. That was always a question on my mind there. Andrew, Core, so big time for you guys post landfall. Let's talk a little bit about then, obviously, how are you going to get your operations up and from a cold start to obviously do what needs to be done for the harbor and the channels?
Right, so 5 p.m. Monday landfall, Cat 3, Baffin Bay, means most likely we've evacuated Corpus, potentially a mandatory evacuation order, which is kind of key for some of our operations. So if the city does actually issue a mandatory evacuation, then we're going to have to get people back in, most likely. We are, kind of consider ourselves first responders. We've been able to get that sort of clearance to get back through roadblocks and things like that. But the idea here would be 5 p.m. landfall, 5 o'clock the next day, we're back. So within 24 hours. And we're starting to take a good look at where we are from an equipment standpoint.
Okay.
If there wasn't a mandatory evacuation, we could have begun surveys. In a perfect scenario, we would be This is a fast-moving storm because it's already north of Austin. We would have started to take surveys within 24 hours. But certainly by 10 a.m. Monday, we would have a plan in place. We would understand where how our assets are, where they're at, and then working with the Coast Guard on what's actually closed, where we're going to start surveying. With the offices in Galveston, and we have a survey office and project office in the valley. Most likely we're surveying north from there, we're surveying south from north, and what remains here is kind of working out. And trying to hit the most high priority stuff first. And of course, if the Port of Corpus is at Zulu, it's going to be focused on trying to get the port open. That can be challenging based on sea state and what's still going on. Fast-moving storm, 2 days later, 3 days later, it ought to be glass. It ought to really help us get surveys. We didn't see that with Harvey. Didn't see that with Hannah. But classic hurricane moving in 2 days, 3 days later, you're going to have nice conditions to go survey.
So you mentioned, Harvey. What some of the lessons learned for your agency organization was from Harvey that's moving forward?
Oh, man, probably more than we can go into in this amount of time. But,
Okay.
and I wrote these questions down, and, I'm going behind or in front of the Coast Guard. But one of the things with Harvey that was super important was the formation of an ICT, and that I and some of my staff were part of that ICT. The other one that was key, and you certainly remember this, is that there was a practice for the coop.
Yeah.
So we had a coop site. We had done a drill, dress rehearsal with everybody there. So we walked in knowing exactly what to do. I will say that from the Southern Area Office standpoint, and really from all of the Corps standpoint, short of our emergency ops, is we don't have a coop site. Our plan is normally to embed with either the U.S. Coast Guard, which has always been my experience, or at another site of opportunity, let's say.
Yeah.
I know that we've had representatives with Port EOC, but we do not have a standalone coop site for the Corps. So normally part of the ICT, we go hang out with the Coast Guard, make sure we're sitting there, right beside them to hear what's going on. And then, of course, as far as rallying our folks is normally right into that coop site or potentially, wherever the Coast Guard's sitting is where we'd have our folks rally at. So.
And I like that, and I appreciate that, and I'm fine with that. You all are good company, for sure. And it's important, obviously, to know where the agencies and organizations are. These, obviously, where we can, communicate. I know a lot of times if we don't know and aren't familiar with other agencies' coop sites or where they're going, or EOCs and things like that, and post-storm recovery, when communication is hampered, that really slows things down in the recovery portion of things, because we got to work in unison. And so having that agency there at our incident command post certainly facilitates that type of communication, fast decision making.
Well, and it makes sense from our standpoint, because we're really taking direction from the captain of the port and Coast Guard. We're one of the federal partners. We have a responsibility, but we're not going to go think this stuff up on our own. Certainly working with the pilots, understanding, if there's concerns with the bar, which there normally are, and did something fall in the water? Are we missing a boat? Did something sink? That way we can focus in our assets to go look at that stuff specifically in the federal channel, but we're not thinking this stuff up on our own. We're taking direction at this point.
Thanks, Andrew. Speaking of the pilots, and so Captain Albrecht, so talk to a little bit about how you all ensure your pilots are ready and available, and ability to obviously get on vessels and start moving them when the time occurs.
We would probably be on a similar time frame as Andrew. I mean, 24 hours later or less, most of us are trying to get back into town. We usually have a letter from the county judge that gives us the right to get back in as first responder or whatever that letter says. But I would say by then, we're already trying to figure out with the Coast Guard if we can start moving our pilot boats back out. I think last time the Coast Guard even went with us on the pilot boat, we surveyed the channel, not for the bottom, but for ATON discrepancies. And so, I mean, we're immediately, when it's safe to do so, and the Coast Guard's on board with it, we're wanting to get our boats back out to Port Aransas, and we're wanting to survey the ATONs. And our boats seem to be, because we want to be together when we do it, the best way to do that. So we're working with him, telling him, you know, like he already knows, the bar is going to be ultra important, and then the rest of the channel to make sure there's no sunken obstructions or you know, some area that shoaled in real fast.
Right.
And so between those two things, I mean, we're hoping we're doing that within probably the first 24 to 36, 48 hours after the storm.
Right on. Okay. Good. Appreciate that. Then you'll go ahead and pass the mic. Let's talk a little bit about Coast Guard and how we ensure continuity of operations. Commander, if you could kind of address a little bit about that, you know, how we ensure that, you know, we are still standing the watch despite the impact of this particular storm.
So it's really, really promising to hear everybody talk about how they're going to lean on the Coast Guard and coordinate with the Coast Guard and everything. It's real. I mean, it's really, really encouraging. And the reason I say that is because in every single case throughout the 16 years that I've been in this organization, one of the most important things that the Coast Guard does is bring people together. It brings people together for coordination. You heard it from 3, 4, 5 different people here where we talk about we're going to get in line with what the Coast Guard says. We're going to take direction from the Coast Guard. We're going to coordinate with the Coast Guard. We're going to talk about doing this. We're going to talk about opening this back up. And there's a pathway for us to do this, and a communication channel that we all stand up in order to in order to communicate with each other, as well as a unified command that will be stood up for recovery operations to make sure that everything gets done as quickly as possible. Now, granted, the Coast Guard is going to concentrate firstly and foremost on the safety of life through search and rescue, and then we're also going to concentrate on environmental response for anything like that. But the first thing that we're going to be thinking about outside of those two exceptions is how fast can we open up this port? What can we do in order to get stuff moving as fast as we possibly can? And we do that through coordination. We do that through, and we don't do it by ourselves. We do that through coordination with the pilots. We do it with the Army Corps to survey the channel, to run test tows. We're talking with the Gulf Intercoastal Canal Association to run test tows of barges through the intercoastal. It's a whole effort. And then we have our own assets that are doing this stuff as well. Like we have aids to navigation teams that are going out to surveying channels as well. Coast Guard Cutter Mallet, and then all connected together through ICS and through the port coordination team.
Good. Speaking of which, and it's a great segue because I let Tony off the hook there. So, Tony,
You're on, Tony.
South Texas Waterways Advisory Committee, how does industry voice their concerns, whether it's, cargo, critical cargo disruptions, running a feedstock, they're dialing back operations as much as possible. How do they voice their concerns to the captain of the port?
All right, so we kind of mentioned the PCT meetings. That's one. At this point, we're looking for like short-term recovery, and the Coast Guard, along with some other partners, would establish the Marine Transportation System Recovery Unit. So, as SWAC members or industry or different parts that have a part of infrastructure related to the port, I would be, as industry, I guess I would be answering the call from the MITSRU on what my impacts are and how my piece of the puzzle impacts everyone else. So, I answer the question? Not yet.
Yeah, but I'm going to drill down farther on that. I'm not going to let you off the hook so quickly. What's the difference? Because you said there's a port coordination team and there's a Marine Transportation System Recovery Unit, or a MTSRU? What's the difference between the two?
Yeah, so the recovery unit is really focused on, in the ICP, looking at short-term and long-term recovery efforts from a total port perspective. PCT will still be alive and well in this, and become the catalyst to feed information into the MTSRU, as well as getting information of where we stand. So separate functions, but the PCT is a critical portion of getting to recovery short term.
I think how you explained it then, correct me if I'm wrong, that the port coordination team is kind of like distribution of information, and dissemination of information through all the different types of industries and organizations and facilities that make up the port complex, as we call it, where the kind of post-storm, the MTSRU is all about obviously getting that information from all those organizations that I just described, and then providing that context, bundling it, packaging it, and giving into an executive summary to the unified command or the captain of the port to kind of make decisions, right, on what industries are really feeling stressed, what things obviously are pressure points and friction points that need to be addressed. Is that a safe assumption?
That's safe, and you bailed me out. Sounds good.
All right. Well, very good. All right. Now I'm going to just kind of throw, so everybody's got to kind of more or less be ready at this, because I'm just going to go through and around the horn and through the table there. So let's talk a little bit about what resources would be required, if needed, to assist in the restoration, reconstitution, and recovery. Core, what is it you have the ability to request within your organization to help with restoration and reconstitution, if you see that your organic resources, the resources that are assigned to Corpus Christi, are not going to be able to meet the demand to get that port open as quickly as possible? The Corps, yeah.
So that's a very good question. And the idea is that we would have some assets on board to not only come up from the south, but also to come in from our other offices up the region. There are multiple survey assets that we have available in Galveston and Port Arthur. If we want to look back at Harvey, which was a kind of a watershed event for a lot of us, in that it was a major storm, came across our channel but didn't impact the inner harbor. One of the interesting things there is that the entire response was handled organically. If we wouldn't have those assets, if they would have been damaged in some way, or and we did have individuals that, our individual employees that came out, but if they would have refused to work, whatever had happened, it would have had a severe impact, because regionally, the damage happened up in Houston.
Yeah.
Never do you expect, or before did we expect, that we wouldn't have had help, the cavalry coming from the home office. And in that case, all of those protocols we'd had in place sort of fell apart because of the impact from people being flooded out, not being able to even get to the dock to get to the boats because of the rains from Harvey up there. I think that's an anomaly. I really would expect that, from a Gulf region standpoint, that we have in place with the navigation restoration team, that we pull in assets from Louisiana, and even with Harvey, we pulled in folks from Alabama. The other assets we have are NOAA, the NRTs. They've come down to assist. They normally are there. We have vessels of opportunity. If we're just talking survey stuff, that we can bring in contractors to get on vessels of opportunity. I know the port helped out tremendously, and the Coast Guard did last time. But probably more importantly is the pilots, and when they make their assessment, that we can focus in and say, hey, we really do have a problem on the bar. that we need to address, but how big is that problem? You know, are we good at 38 feet, or, you know, do we really, happens a lot, or 36 feet? There's a class of vessel that we can bring in a lot of times, even if we don't have really good data out there. Used to be a lot more common.
Yeah.
Now there's a lot more visibility, I would say, on looking at this. But as far as bringing in assets, it's really a Gulf-wide effort. That if we had lost everything here, we would be getting help from around the Gulf of Mexico, from other Corps agencies and private contractors.
Thank you. Appreciate that. You mentioned a little bit about the pilot, so you can go ahead and pass the mic to Captain Albrecht. So, you know, obviously there's going to be a lot of damage post storm, ATON off station, ranges down. What is it that you need from an aids to navigation standpoint, minimal aids to navigation standpoint? What's critical for obviously piloting a ship inbound post-storm?
Man, that's a great question. What's critical? I mean, beacons and buoys in the turns are pretty critical because it's kind of nice to know when you need to make a turn. I think it was Harvey. There wasn't many ATONs left, and you know, we started with some lighter draft ships because of shoaling. I don't see shoaling being as big an issue now because the channel's so deep. I think it's going to be a higher draft of restriction at some point, but that's just an assumption. But I think we would probably work on some beacons and buoys in the turns, and then from there, if I remember correctly, we did a lot of one-way traffic, 2 pilots, 2 computers, and we ran convoy systems in and out, and it seemed to manage it pretty well for a while. But to say that there's one critical aid or that they're all critical on normal circumstances, we were able to work around a lot of that. But beacons and turns would be probably the first thing I'd ask for if we were prioritizing.
Good to know. Also, a question you mentioned, you know, kind of the test vessels in a sense. I mean, I hate to call them that, but what's your criteria, and how are you going to determine kind of, besides just draft, because I know that's kind of, that seems pretty obvious, when you determine which vessels to come in first, because there's going to be a huge queue out there. So how are you guys kind of figuring out which ones are going to be the ones that are going to come in first, besides just necessarily draft?
I mean, once we figure out the draft, I think the way that we would pick a vessel would be the one that's easiest to pilot, the one that has the best visibility, the one that we feel would steer the best and be the most manageable under these circumstances.
Okay. Now, does the facility it's going to also come into play?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a whole, Kristen and I were just talking about this yesterday. They showed a great description of those AIS targets as the storm came and all the ships ran south or north. And so what happens is every dock wants their ship, but they don't know where their ship is. So we get on these PCT calls or these, and everybody says, hey, I want my ship, and it's a priority. And then we look on AIS and they're 167 miles away, and they want it to be first in line. So there's a reality check at some point during that of we put everybody on priority. Every ship's a priority. Yes, we want to get everybody's vessel in as efficiently as possible. And so it's really just a house of cards that we build once we start getting dealt cards.
Okay. Thank you. Hey, so everybody's already started put their pitch in for prioritization. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Tim, about the ferry system. What happens if there is serious damage to the ferry landings? What's the workaround? What's the plan?
The state will use all of its assets to get something back in operation. You know, pick the landing with the least amount of damage and work on that one until we have a lot of spare parts. I think the reality of losing a hole where we wouldn't have at least one ramp would be pretty nil. I think they're pretty strong ramp systems, so I don't think we'd ever get down to where we wouldn't have at least one ramp on each side.
And you're saying you would potentially just rob from the other landings to at least get one put together then, huh?
Correct.
Okay. Good. One of the things I want to circle back to is that for the Coast Guard is I've heard this term of art that says that's opened, the port open with restrictions. Can you explain what that means?
Certainly. So port open with restrictions, what that means is what we're still trying to do is we're trying to assess the damage to the port. So damage to the port, damage to the waterways. And we assess this through, depending on our pilot association, on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for figuring out the depths of channels and stuff like that. And then as well as running test tows with GICA, with the Gulf Intracoastal Association, or Canal Association rather. And once we get a better picture as to what the status of the port is and how much damage the port incurred, we can allow vessels to start going, allow vessels of smaller draft, lighter draft, light ship to go through, kind of like a, first we test tow, like we throw a test tow in there so that we can figure out like barge traffic situation, what the deep draft situation is as well. Can we get those vessels in at the at what point can we bring these vessels of light, heavier tonnage in and stuff like that? And then once we figure out and get a better picture of it, we can start opening up the port to those larger vessels.
Okay, I appreciate that. Port Authority. So, question for you, Director Gutierrez. You went through Harvey. What are some of the lessons learned for the Port Authority from Harvey that you're moving forward with?
Are you saying lessons learned?
Yeah, any lessons learned
so
from Harvey?
I'll break from everybody else. That's a terrible question, Zach. It's not very good. So lessons learned, it's kind of, for me, I wasn't here at the port, but I do know, if I remember correctly, Danielle, that was the first time that they stood up in an IMT here at the Port of Corpus Christi. So am I correct in that, Danielle? That was the first time y'all stood up the IMT so from there, I think Danielle brought a wealth of information from her previous job here to the port, so they were able to start working through all of the issues that they were going through with an IMT. So lessons learned, obviously, was an IMT is essential to being able to get back to normal operations as soon as possible. And so I know since then, the hurricane plans, all hazards plan, it has really blossomed from that, and just the importance of having that, and the post recovery, the damage assessment teams to ensure that you understand what you're really looking at post storm, and then getting all that information back into one central hub where you can start disseminating that information and getting back to where you need to be.
You brought up something that's piqued my interest, was these damage, assist teams or evaluation teams or something like that. So, Coast Guard, you have such a thing, and what are those? What is it they're looking at as far as post-storm recovery kind of evaluation of whether or not the port is ready and will be open for business anytime soon? These damage kind of review assessments.
Again, it's really more along the lines of just a coordination between everybody. It's us figuring out what the the depth is. It starts figuring out what the status of the channel is, what the aids to navigation, how much damage that had, and how much aids have been restored, as well as talking to our facility operators to make sure that they, they start. We coordinate with them when they start with the storms as well, making sure that their facility is up and ready to go and what their status is. Obviously, it doesn't do much good to bring in a gigantic tanker if the facility is not ready to take a tanker in. So it's really about, like, again, this is the Coast Guard's main game, and why I like this organization so much is because we bring everybody together, and we're the ones that communicate, and we're the ones that coordinate and say, hey, tell me about your situation, and we will prioritize and we will work with you to make sure that we find a way to get this port back open as fast as we can.
Good. I'm going to put the Corps on the spot a little bit. So you have multiple ports that are impacted. We kind of saw that in Harvey. You have major ports, 900-pound gorilla ports, in a sense, that are all impacted. How do you prioritize which ones are going to get the assets and the most attention from? How do you evaluate, in a sense, what's going to get the assets for the Corps?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think a point was just made about, bringing in a tanker to a facility that's not ready to accept a tanker. So a couple of things. One is obviously working with the Coast Guard and through the Gulf region, navigation restoration team. Those groups set priorities. In my experience, I've seen two things that sort of drove priority. The first, and I think folks here that were here can remember the feedstock conversations that we had post-Harvey, because the damage was out and all the issues were out away from the industrial base here. So the plants were up and running. And the last thing that anybody wants to do is see one of these refineries shut down because there's not enough product to refine. And so there were some big conversations about getting tankers in. Ike was a different situation because Ike actually closed the bar in Corpus and Matagorda, I don't think in Brownsville, but closed those areas because it was so big, so much water was moving, and absolutely devastated Houston. And so in that case, and there were some other things involved, but one of them was the refinery capacity was severely impacted in Houston. I want to say that was some politics going on, but however, the way we had refineries here that needed feedstock again. But so in priority for Houston, since everything was shut down, the priority became opening going towards Houston. In Harvey, post-Harvey, even Houston was flooded and shut down, but here we were fine on the inside, so priority became opening up Corpus. So each storm's a little different. You got to look at what's going to make the most sense to prioritize going forward. The other thing about this is that it's not only the deep draft, but the shallow draft stuff. And so when we're talking about opening and outside, coming towards us or coming towards the center, you can look at areas that are using brown water facilities, and the intercoastal is severely impacted. Yeah. And we really need to go deal with the intercoastal while we're waiting for, let's say, the Sea State and the Gulf of Mexico to get to a point that we can get offshore and get the bar and get that evaluated. So it's situation dependent. It's very, very helpful and absolutely mandatory to work with our federal partners and local sponsors to understand what is priority, and then to be able to move those assets in to get that.
Very good. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hey, Zach.
Yeah, we got questions. I don't know where
I'm
you're
gonna
at.
hide behind a pole over here.
Where are you?
There
you
you
are. All right. You got any questions?
I have an anonymous question that was submitted.
Absolutely.
Partially probably textile, a little bit of DPS and law enforcement, but I have an amazing person over here in uniform that I know is going to help me answer it. So, question is, when do we shut down the Harbor Bridge?
Oh. Who's willing to answer that one?
Hello, Billy Breedlove, Deputy Chief with the Corpus Christi Police Department. And so we'll work in partnership with DPS and TxDOT. And it's really pretty simple. It's just, when is it unsafe? You know, we sort of have that 45-mile-an-hour tropical force winds that we start taking a better look at what calls of services we're responding to throughout the city and the community. But we'll keep traffic open until it becomes unsafe to do so. And it'll take, like I said, a partnership between those three agencies, us, DPS, and TxDOT.
Hey, Billy, question for you. Do you start like slowly restricting it? Because I remember in certain places, certain times that is something called high-profile vehicles or something like that that are
Correct. So that'll be a lot of it is messaging, right? So the first thing is our PIOs, all of them putting out the information. The high-profile vehicles we want off the road, a long time before we start seeing any of the wind. But then we really leave it up to the conditions, and we're not going to probably stop a vehicle that an 18-wheeler or something that's going over it because we think it's going to, but we'll definitely be watching it and say if like it's unsafe for a certain type of vehicle, then it's unsafe for all. That'll be sort of the cutoff. We're not going to say, okay, only passenger vehicles get to go now. It just gets to a point where we think any vehicle that is out on the roadway may impact it. It's easier to just shut the whole thing down rather than.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it. Any other questions? Daniel's got a hot mic out there for this esteemed panel of agencies and organizations. I'm sure you must have something that's kind of gnawing at you a little bit in your mind.
Anybody but Captain Miller. Anybody going?
Hey. No, I don't. It's not really a question, but I just want to emphasize what's important from my perspective, and I think just about everybody else in this harbor here, is that port coordination team that was talked about. That's crucial. That's crucial because he's on that call, 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 and somebody from this table is usually on that call too. The dissemination of that information back to me so that I can go back to my facility and let them know things aren't looking good for, you need to get this ship out, you need to get this ship in, whatever. But that's a crucial piece of pre and post storm. What we don't know, at least during my time here, is when there's been a storm that blew out communication. Don't know what's going to happen with the PCT call at that point, but that's a critical piece of this whole hurricane pre and post scenario.
So, you wanted to talk a little bit more about that then?
Not about communications, but this is a plug for STWAC, STWAC here. So yeah, what Mr. Miller mentioned here, SWAC's a good organization to join because it organically flows through it. We really look for the term members in our 16 industry sectors to really push out that information to everyone, and it's really key in decision making, as individual organizations on where the direction, where things are going. To hear the information that it may be a couple of days until ATON's back on station, or a couple of days until surveys are complete to make those business decisions. So organically, there's other avenues for the information, but if you're a member of STWAC, you'll be getting that information from your term members.
All right, I think we have time for one more question before I turn it over to Ms. Roth. A quick note, the survey information is on your agenda. Some folks have started submitting those surveys, which is great. EOC@Pcca.com. If you have any questions that you still haven't had answered, you're welcome to email or text them to me, and we'll make sure that the right folks get those questions answered for you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Roth, and then we're going to move on to closing comments.
Hi there, I'm Stephanie Roth. I'm with Allegiance Mobile Health. We're an ambulance service. And my question is for Mr. Timothy Lewis regarding the water ferry service. What is the expected downtime for the inspections of the landings and the ferries to be back up in service for emergency response?
During Harvey, we were actually taking emergency vehicles in 72 hours, just to kind of give you an idea. Every storm's going to be different. It's hard to predict exactly what that time period is going to be, but it's normally pretty quick.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's attention. Let's give a round of applause to our panel members. Thank you all. Appreciate it. You all are off the hook. I would like to, and it is my distinct pleasure, to introduce the captain of the port, the federal on-scene coordinator, the SAR mission coordinator, the officer in charge of marine inspection, the federal maritime security, the young man a long time ago from Corpus Christi, Texas, Captain Jason Gunning.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope this seminar went well. I apologize I wasn't able to be here sooner and longer to listen to more of the presentations, but I assume everyone that attended is absolutely perfectly prepared now for hurricanes. If you weren't before, now you're more so prepared, right? We had Clark and Danielle and National Hurricane Center, and then of course Mr. Modis with the National Weather Service, and we, I presume, talked about La Niñas and how many hurricanes we're going to get this year, right? Did they come out with the final forecast on predictions, or tomorrow? Tomorrow, yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry, you must be Mr. Lancey, right? All right, I got to put two and two together. But my assumption is that you know, pay attention to that prediction, but that it'll have some pretty healthy numbers in it for this coming year. You know, find some wood, knock on it. Even though we're in drought, you know, I don't want to be wishing even for a low tropical depression or anything like that to bring in a storm. I just assume they all go north and up on the East Coast, or just spin around in the Atlantic and disappear somewhere. But it's nonetheless, you all know, just looking back over the history, especially those who've been around for a while, that the hurricanes are a real risk that we need to be ready for. And not being the weatherman, I don't know, ask National Weather Service more details, but I think we all noticed that the weather's been a little bit more unpredictable in the last few years. It was good. When did we see that one? I don't know, but the number of storms, I forgot exactly, maybe you all showed it, but the number of storms that develop out in the Bay of Campeche, in the Gulf of Mexico, that end up hitting the Gulf, that end up hitting us in the Western Gulf is rather large, right? So we don't always have that 5-day stream of waiting it out to predict it, right? It's something that spins up, and then they're rapidly getting more aggressive here. If they spin up in the Gulf, you can't assume it's just going to be a tropical depression and something that we can just ignore, right? Last year, I think spun up to Category 2, what's that? Yeah, pretty quickly. So, I greatly appreciate the port putting this on, hosting this, trying to create the community awareness, all the attendance from the OGAs, from our sister agency with the National Weather Service, and the volunteer agencies. I see TechSAR out there. Thank you very much, Tim, and your team being out here. I don't know who else I recognize out there, but except for all the industry that's out there as well. You know, it's a team effort. Coast Guard, as far as managing the waterway, is there to do our part in accordance in sharing it with the Army Corps, keeping the waterways open, getting them open, making sure that it's cleared for vessels to sail. But you know, it's primary, and it's also, I think, ancillary to the broader damage that's going to be going on that we're all going to need to be paying attention to, right? So all of it at the same time. I guess that's how those operations go. You don't just get to deal with one. That's the nature of the hurricane. You don't get to deal with just one thing at a time. It's all of the emergency response efforts at the same time. So they get rather challenging. With that, I don't know, did I do good enough for you, Danielle? Did I cover the main topics? I did wonderful again. I like Zach's. Zach, you're finally hitting the 1-2 on the intro there, right? 4 years in, and yeah. Well, but anyways, thank you all very much. I appreciate the attendance. You have a great day. We look forward to seeing you in the near future. Hopefully not at the Ortiz Center in an IMT for post-hurricane response, right? Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Captain Gunning. I truly appreciate you and your partnership and allowing your team to continue to collaborate with us. This program, one, your feedback is important. So the survey, we do look at the survey, we read the survey, and we try to take in your needs into consideration when we build the program. But the relationship with National Weather Service, Coast Guard, it's a collaborative effort to try to put these together for you and meet your needs. It's a great day in Port of Corpus Christi. It's a great day in the Coastal Bend. I love this community. I live here. I thrive here. Each of you do and your families. I truly appreciate from the bottom of my heart your commitment to preparedness, your company, your organization, whomever is compelling you to be here, voluntold, volunteer. Thank you, and thank you to those that you report with and to who are supporting you to be here as well. So please do complete the survey. Really, really appreciate it, and it'll help us build that presentation for next year. Thank you, Dr. Lancey. Appreciate you making the trip from Miami. Final round of applause for him, and thank you all.